Really excited to be here, Aaron. I have a bunch of questions, and I'm hoping that me as well as our audience can learn a little bit from this conversation today. So really excited to dive in.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to dive in and exchange some ideas.
Right. So Aaron, right off the bat, I know that you run a community around LearnGRC where you're helping, professionals in the GRC space build careers in GRC. And, as a result, you have seen like people who are looking at companies who are trying to build a security program and their compliance program internally. And based on that experience and based on what you've typically seen, both, as you work at Deloitte as well, what would you say are the top three things that a company should be focusing on when they're trying to, demonstrate their security posture to external parties? This could be either customers or partners or anybody else. Do you encounter this situation, and what would be your top three recommendations here?
Sure. So the first thing that comes to my mind is to foster a culture of transparency. So cybersecurity has a lot to do with communication, from my experience. Many organizations face challenges where they have to react to vulnerabilities, they have to react to cyber threats, to attacks, to incidents. And it's always a good sign and a great sign for outsiders to see how they communicate that stuff. Are they open? Are they transparent? Do they keep customers in the loop in case something happens? And this will build trust over time, which is essential to really demonstrate that your security posture is existent and it's evolving. The second thing that comes to my mind is to undergo third-party audits, like, for example, ISO 27001. These certifications are a great way to demonstrate your security posture, or at least demonstrate your efforts in that space. And I think we'll talk about the business enablement aspect later on. And this goes hand in hand from my experience. And then last but not least, I also think it's a great idea to provide customers with something like an information security statement or something like a trust center where they can get information about the security posture, about the controls that are applied, and just to provide them with a little handout, let's say.
That's a great point, Aaron. I especially like the first point that you talked about, which is simply about communicating openly, both internally as well as externally. That builds trust in me as a customer, that we all know that things can sometimes go wrong. But when I have the trust that you'll basically be openly sharing things, if and when that happens, that actually helps a lot. So that's not an often talked about point about how crucial communication is and transparency in communication is. But I'm glad that you brought that up. That sort of helps me. I think we passingly touched upon this in your answer as well. But it is security or GRC as a function is often looked at originally as a defensive thing. It's something where you are investing a lot of time, effort, energy, money, and it's a defensive thing. But increasingly, we are also seeing modern security leaders to start thinking of this as a sales enablement thing. So this is not just a way for you to protect yourself from attacks, but also a way of positioning your organization as a more mature, as a more reliable partner to work with. Do you see that? And do you have any tips on how do you start looking as a security leader or as a CISO at this as a sales enablement thing rather than just a like a data protection thing?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Girish. So we can definitely see that security has become a prerequisite if you want to make business with a company. Usually when you start negotiating with any type of client and you are processing their data, they will reach out to you in terms of minimum security baselines that you have to fulfill, or they will expect you to showcase your security posture through certificates, for example, through penetration test reports, through SOC reports, and all these things that come into your mind when you think about that. And what is also important is you have to build that trust with the customer. So they will only do business with you and provide you with their data in case they trust you. And this is exactly where the CISO or the security department comes into play. You have to make the business or your sales team aware that security can be the ultimate prerequisite to get into business. And when that is clear, then you turn into a department that's not just that doesn't just cost money, but also brings benefit to the whole organization. And if that shift of mind takes place, then I think the whole organization is on a great way.
Great, that's a great point. The next question that pops in my head is about organizations typically don't directly jump into a state where they have a mature GRC function or security as a function. They go through some growth banks and they typically start very small, and then eventually over time, this sort of matures, and there are some scars to show along the way. So I'm curious through your experience of seeing some organizations gone through this journey or speaking with people who've gone through this journey. What are some of the trends or the pain points that you've commonly seen as organizations mature their GRC function from a very infant stage to something that's probably fairly more rigorous?
It's also a very great question because a lot of organizations struggle with this. When it comes to the GRC space, we have to understand that there are certain elements that are interrelated with each other. So we have threats that exploit vulnerabilities of assets. These assets enable business operations. And if this is infringed in some way, we have risks that materialize, become incidents, and so on and so on. So if an organization is small, it is but it's like easier to keep everything in perspective. And if something happens, you know who's in charge of this, who's in charge of that, and you get like the connection of all these items. If you get larger, you tend to have these isolated silos. So there are certain functions within the GRC space that are no longer like connected. They don't talk with each other. Information is not flowing. And then it starts to getting harder and harder, especially if you don't have the right GRC tools in place. So, I mean, we know for sure GRC is mostly done through Excel spreadsheets still to this day. And if your organization grows and grows and grows, this gets harder and harder and harder. So I think this is also a big challenge. You just get to a point where it's not working like it used to before. And I think this relates to this hyper growth stage where just things don't work anymore.
Makes sense. Aron, you talked about isolated information silos that tend to happen as organizations grow, and especially when they grow really fast. And so I'm curious, and you also spoke to one of the earlier questions about how important it is to communicate internally as much as we do externally. And I've seen that, at least some of the orgs try to think of information security training as one of the ways to sort of build consensus and communicate more about what they do for information security, because oftentimes people are the weakest link, and you could do everything which is the bleeding edge technology that you want to do, but that tends to happen. So I'm just curious about how you think about this. Like, do you think information security training should factor in during the high growth stages of an organization, or are there other tools that security leaders can use to effectively communicate about the importance of security to the larger organization?
Of course. So I think the larger an organization becomes, the larger its exposure to cyber threats or threats in general gets. This, of course, leads to an increased demand in training, because your employees will just be more vulnerable or more exposed to these types of threats. Now, when it comes to information security, of course, the mission or the purpose of an organization is not to have secure assets, but they want to provide value to their stakeholders. So it's very important to align these goals with the overall business objectives of an organization, make the risks that are related to a lack of training transparent to senior leadership, especially by, for example, referencing to similar organizations in the same industry that have been victim of a cyber threat, of a ransomware attack, whatever. And this will usually initiate like a shift of mind in many minds. And last but not least, of course, it's about money. So you can also compare the costs of an incident with the costs for training. And if this cost-benefit analysis is positive, in combination with the alignment with business objectives and a transparent risk communication, then I think you have a pretty good chance of getting the training program approved.
I had a curious question about that. In your experience, budget approvals for training programs, how do they typically go? Is this something that that is usually easily accepted? Is that something that takes a little bit of persuasion and convincing? What's your experience with that?
Actually, I only made good experiences with that. So most organizations are aware that it's necessary. The question is, what is a good security training, and what is it tailored for? So, of course, the people in the security department, they get very specific training for their specific roles and jobs and tasks, but they're not really the persons that are so vulnerable to these attacks. In fact, it's the people in the front line and the operating part of the organization. They need to get training. And this is where it gets tricky, because of course they are not so into all these things. They want to do their job, and they often see that as a burden from my experience. Got it.
That makes so much sense. Just to change tracks a little bit, Aron, we spoke about security and some of the baseline things that we could do in order to make sure that you're both secure and compliant. But there's typically the other side of the coin, which is about organizations also starting to think proactively from a risk standpoint. So you could derive your security program from the risk that you perceive as an organization. So in your experience, are organizations thinking and treating risk as a distinct and independent function, or does this often get smudged and overlapped with security or compliance? How does this look like to you in the world out there?
I think that really depends. So first of all, I think most of us do risk management all the time. I always tell people, so if you stand next to a pool or to a big lake and you want to jump in because it's so hot outside, you usually look first what is underneath the surface. It's really a good idea to jump in. And so I think that also translates well to the business world. You have, of course, different functions in an organization, and not all of them have a risk register, and they have a formal risk assessment process and whatever it takes to do risk management. But of course, they base their decisions on some assessments, on their experience. They value, they balance things out. And so risk management is done all the time. The question is it a formalized risk management process? And this is where it gets tricky. So I come from a background having done a lot with management systems. As you know, management systems can be integrated. For example, a quality management system based on ISO 9001, ISMS based on 27001, and what they're all called, they all basically have the same structure. So it's pretty easy to integrate them with each other. And all of these management systems mandate to have a risk management in place with a specific focus. So is it quality risk? Is it an information security risk, a health and safety risk, an environmental risk, and so on and so on. And the question is, if organizations align these risk management practices and form an integrated management system, or do they have these silos? Now, I've seen both. I've seen great integrated management systems, but I've also seen organizations that tend to have a separate perspective on these things, which can also be totally fine as long as the results are reported to the correct decision makers, basically.
Got it. That's actually a beautiful way of putting it. I think if I have to paraphrase your answer, is risk is something which is common sense. We do it every day, every day of our lives, and it's also core to fairly standard frameworks like the ISO frameworks. And if you basically find a good system of record that helps you translate that in the way your business runs, then you're doing typically well as a risk function. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. I think that's what I wanted to say.
Great, Aaron. So, Aaron, I've run through most of the questions that I had for this conversation. I have one last one before we could take some questions from the audience as well. The thing that I'm curious about is, imagine I am a young professional in the GRC space, joining a company that's relatively new in terms of setting up its GRC function. What are the couple of things that you would tell me about how I should approach this?
That's a tough question. So first of all, that's how I did it. Get your hands on as many books and papers as possible and build a solid foundation. There are a lot of great free stuff available. So there's no need to spend a lot of money on courses or books in the first hand. If you look, for example, at NIST, they provide a ton of great material describing the basic concepts behind the GRC space. And just by reading that, you will just boost your understanding if you read it. Sometimes people tend to just study these frameworks a little bit, read the first page and something like that. That doesn't work. Read it from the first to the last page. And then, that's how I did it, try to explain it in simple terms. And if you can explain it in simple terms, then you understand it. If you can't understand it in simple terms, you didn't understand it.
Wow, that's a great tip. I think that's a good threshold to be able to cover. Like if you can explain it to someone who doesn't know about this already, you could be pretty confident that you actually understand it.
Exactly.
Great. Aaron, I think this has been great. And, I've been noticing that there are a few questions that the audience has as well for you. So I'm going to let Aarti ask you some of those questions, and, maybe that's a good next segue.
Yes, a great session, Aaron and Girish, extremely insightful. I'm just to let everyone know, we are at the 15-minute time check. We are now in the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask them. First is for Aaron. What inspired you to become a GRC influencer, and how did you get started with this niche?
I was actually always very passionate about teaching and coaching. So in a previous life, I worked as a basketball coach, teaching and mentoring, of course, athletes. And when I transitioned into the corporate world, I just was passionate about this. And I thought to myself, like I said to Girish, if I can explain it to others, then I make sure I understand it myself. And this turned out to be a win-win situation for my audience and for myself, of course. So I think that pretty much sums it up.
All right. I hope that answers your questions. I think if you have any follow-ups, I think we've also linked Aaron's LinkedIn profile here, so you can reach out and even check out his content. The next is, how can organizations determine if it's the right time to pursue InfoSec compliance? I think this should be for both you and for Girish.
Aaron, go ahead. I'll take the next one.
Well, I think when is it the right time? I think the moment you start processing data at a larger scale and you feel vulnerable to outside threats, then I think you should get going, So I think it can't be early enough in these days. But Girish, maybe you want to add something?
No, I think I agree with you on by and large, Aaron. I think this is a business imperative now. So, and that could happen either because you as a business are processing a large amount of data, especially if that's sensitive data of any sort. There could be different degrees of sensitivity. It could be financial information, personal information, healthcare information, stuff like that. So then it's basically a day zero thing. You can't be in business without actually paying attention to information security compliances. But there are also other times where this becomes a business imperative, not just because you're processing data, but you simply want to demonstrate that you're not a fly-by-night operator, and you're serious about running this business, and you are about whatever data that you process from your prospective customers, you're committed as an organization to keep it safe. So it could be a signaling thing as well. So it surely, one way or the other, comes down to a business imperative, either because of the nature of the data that you process, the regulatory environment or the geography that you're in, or simply because your customers, your partners, your cybersecurity insurer, or your board or somebody else expects you to have it. So with the general principle that earlier the better, there are some realities of the world that you operate in as a business, which is likely going to tell you that you need to do this at a certain time.
Absolutely.
I hope that answered your question. Feel free to add a follow-up in case you'd like more clarity. You have another question. How do you stay updated on the latest developments in GRC, and what sources or platforms do you find most valuable for networking and learning within the community? I think this is for both of you. Aron, do you want to get started?
Sure. I mean, primarily, of course, LinkedIn. There's a lot of great people on LinkedIn that share so much information, not just from their jobs, but also from what they cover up, from what they hear about. And I think LinkedIn is my go-to source to stay up to date in the GRC space.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what Aron said. Case in point, we met Aron on LinkedIn. So, there you go. It works. Yeah, that's primarily been by I think there is if I have to point to a single largest source of how I learn about GRC, it would be LinkedIn. And then there's a long tail of other things which pop up in my feeds one way or the other. But if there's one single place where I learn more about GRC, that's LinkedIn again for me.
Okay. And finally, we have one more question. For individuals interested in pursuing a career in GRC, what advice or steps would you recommend for them to get started and excel in this field?
Aron, you're the best person to answer this.
Well, I mean, first of all, just get started. I know many people struggle to make the first step. They feel like, oh, I don't have the skills. I feel like applying. I don't have these certifications they are requiring me to have. So forget about all that. Get started. When I got started, I actually started a job in quality management, basically. And this job was in a data center. And very fast, I learned that in a data center, quality, information security, cybersecurity, privacy, they are closely aligned. And from then on, I just learned the next thing. And all that was just possible because I got started in there. And if you are in there, I mean, opportunities are going to arise. And from then on, you just have to see what's possible for you. Keep studying, keep learning. And good things come to those who work. So just go after it.
Aron, if I may add to that question, like what is implicit to your answer is that you don't necessarily need to be from a GRC background to do well at GRC. And I think that's a great thing to know. And I'm just curious if are there any prerequisites that you think I should have as a young professional trying to enter into the GRC space?
I mean, it's of course easier if you have already worked in an organization and you know how organizations function. I think that's some kind of prerequisite. You have to be able to understand the business model of an organization, and you need good communication skills, orally and written, of course. But is it really an obstacle if you don't have that and you are a young graduate that wants to get started? No. Does it make your life easier in the beginning? Of course, but that shouldn't hinder you from my experience.
That helps. Thanks so much, Aron. Marty, we're done with all questions?
Yes, we are. Thank you so much, Aron and Girish, for your time. And I really appreciate you taking your time for this and like sharing your insights.